did try, and they didn't get any signal from it, then they would have concluded either that they were off course, or that the beacon was not operational. If they figured that the beacon was not operational, they would have contacted air traffic control, or at least the other Korean Airlines crew, to ask whether this was the case. But we know that they never did this. We also know that they didn't try to pick it up and then conclude that they were off course, because if they had done this, they would have realized that they were off course, and they would have corrected for it. So, this just leaves us with one possibility. The crew of Flight 7 never checked their position relative to the beacon at St. Paul. Why might this be? Why would a crew flying long distances over open ocean fail to do such a simple and mandatory check to confirm that they were on course? There are two concerning possibilities here. Negligence, or perhaps worse, there is the possibility that the crew never intended to follow the flight plan. Within a few minutes, Flight 7 had crossed the international dateline, and with that, into Soviet airspace. It was now September 1st, 1983. A few hundred miles ahead of Flight 7, the Soviets had gone into panic stations. They had caught sight of the US spy plane on radar, circling to the east of the Kamchatka Peninsula. This was not the first time in recent weeks that they had spotted a US spy plane in their airspace. In fact, just recently, many high-ranking Soviet commanders had been fired for failing to shoot down infringing aircraft before they got away. On this night, the commanders at Kamchatka were determined not to let this happen to them. In the cockpit of Flight 7, the alert button on the INS flashed orange, indicating that the plane had passed its next waypoint, Neva. The way the INS works, this flash happens not when the plane reaches the waypoint, but rather when it comes closest to it on its route. This meant that the flashing light alone was not confirmation that the plane was on course. However, through years of normal use, this was how the pilots of Flight 7 interpreted it. The pilots' manuals specified that when this light flashed, signifying that they had passed a waypoint, they should carry out a number of checks to confirm their position. This included plotting their present position on a chart. It also involved checking any radio beacons within range, and it involved confirming that the plane turned as expected towards the next waypoint on its route. If the pilots had carried out any of these checks, they would have seen that they were way off course. In fact, by now, they were already 160 nautical miles north of where they should have been, or about 300 kilometers. If they had plotted their coordinates on a map, they would have seen that this planted them squarely inside forbidden airspace. They were now flying through a buffer zone between US and Soviet airspace. This buffer zone was off limits to civilian aircraft, and what's worse, if the pilots kept flying, they would soon end up in Soviet airspace. This was a terrifying prospect. Just 5 years previously, another Korean Airlines passenger jet had strayed off course into Soviet airspace and was shot down over northern Russia. Incredibly, that aircraft met a fortunate end, landing safely on a frozen lake, with all but 2 of the passengers surviving the ordeal. But there was no guarantee that things would go so well on this night. Not least because right at that very second, Soviet radar installations on Kamchatka had caught sight of Flight 7 on radar. As 269 passengers and crew on board Flight 7 cruised through the skies above the Pacific, they were completely oblivious to the fact that they were now being watched closely on Soviet military radar. They also didn't know that just 10 minutes flying time off to their right-hand side, a US spy plane was circling, gathering intelligence about an enemy which they were now about to inadvertently fly. The Soviets were tracking both of these aircraft and had previously identified the US spy plane correctly as an RC-135. It struck them as odd, however, that the second plane was being so daring. Rather than circling just within range of the peninsula, it appeared to be heading straight forward. Its altitude and speed were constant too. Whatever this plane was, it apparently wasn't concerned about the possibility of being intercepted. And as Flight 7 neared the Kamchatka Peninsula, that's exactly what happened. Soviet commanders scrambled 4 fighter jets to intercept the plane. They took to the skies and immediately began racing towards the wayward aircraft. In the cockpit of the Korean Airlines Jumbo, the pilots continued on talking as normal, both amongst themselves and to their colleagues on Flight 15. They were oblivious to the fact that they were hundreds of miles from where they thought they were, deep within Soviet airspace. As this was happening, fighter jets were being vectored by Soviet ground control at lightning speed towards the mystery intruder. Fighter jets are fast, but commercial aircraft are fast too, and Flight 7 was travelling at over 80% the speed of sound. The race was truly on. Would the fighter jets be able to reach the aircraft before it slipped back into international waters? Or would Flight 7 end up in a fireball over the Kamchatka Peninsula after being mistaken for a spy plane? The pilots didn't know it, but as they sat there talking in the warm cocoon of the cockpit, they were racing towards an international border which was their salvation. The Soviet fighter jets sped closer and closer, but just as they were beginning to close in on the wayward flight, they ran out of fuel. Reluctantly, they turned around and returned to base. Flight 7 blissfully crossed back into international waters, none the wiser about how close it had come to disaster. Not long after, the plane was out of range of Soviet radar too, and once again, its true position over planet Earth was unknown to anyone outside, or indeed, anyone on board. But ignorance wouldn't be bliss for long. A few hundred miles ahead of the flight, on the island of Sakhalin, the Soviets were waiting. Their Kamchatka comrades had alerted them to the presence of a mystery intruder, heading southwest towards their position. The flight was still outside of radar range of Sakhalin Island. The Soviets began preparing. This time, they wouldn't miss their chance. On board Flight 7, the pilots still had some time to notice their incredible error. But for that to happen, something would have to alert them to one of the many anomalies appearing on their INS screens. At this point, the pilots were transferred from Anchorage Air Traffic Control to Tokyo Control. They told Tokyo that they had just passed the waypoint Nippy at 9 minutes past 5 GMT, and that they were expecting to reach their next waypoint, Noka, at 26 minutes past 6. Tokyo Air Traffic Control acknowledged their message. All appeared normal on the flight deck. The crew were in range of Tokyo Air Traffic Control, so they no longer needed their colleagues to act as a relay. The coordinates on the INS were still showing the plane to be well off course, but unless the pilots actually plotted these coordinates on a map, they were unlikely to notice. Meanwhile, Soviet commanders on the island of Sakhalin had been told that there had been a border violation over Kamchatka, and that what was probably a US RC-135 was now 500 kilometers from their position, flying towards the island on a heading of 240. The commanders waited eagerly for the target to appear on their radar, and at 5:45 PM GMT, that's exactly what happened. A blip appeared, matching the description given by the officers at Kamchatka. Altitude, 9,000 meters. Speed, 800 kilometers per hour. Some officers speculated that this could be a civilian aircraft, or even a Soviet jet which was out of radio contact. After all, what US spy plane in its right mind would fly in a straight line at a constant altitude and speed for hours on end? Was this some kind of bluff? At the same time, other officers contended that there was no way it could be a civilian aircraft. It was over 500 kilometers from the nearest passenger air route, and it had entered their airspace in the same place where a known US spy plane was orbiting. But in truth, there was only one way to identify the mystery aircraft. The Soviets put 2 fighter jets at the ready. When the time came, they would scramble these jets and track down the intruding aircraft. And they would have to identify it fast before it got away a second time. Their careers were depending on it. Back on Flight 7, much more than careers were at stake, but the crew were as oblivious as ever. The flight attendants made an announcement to the passengers. They would be landing in Seoul in 3 hours, and would shortly be coming around the cabin with beverages and breakfast. Meanwhile, the pilots continued chatting with the crew of Flight 15.
We have a pleasant chat because Mr. Kim here is giving us a little fun. Well, after arrival in Seoul, it's better for you to study all those things. Study what? There's nothing to be studied. By the way, what a good season. It's autumn. I hope I could take a day off Make a schedule. Why don't you take some time off and go to Sorak Mountain? Are you about 3 minutes ahead of us?
Throughout their journey, the crew of Flight 7 had had ample opportunity to notice the deviation in their flight path. There were several anomalies, from poor radio signals with anchorage air traffic control, to waypoints which they seemed to be passing slightly later than expected. But now, the crew would get one more sign that something was off. During their casual conversation with their colleagues on Flight 15, they exchanged information on the winds which they were experiencing.
How much do you get there? How much and which direction? 206. 35 knots. Which direction? 040. 040. 30 degrees. 30 knots. 40 degrees direction, 35 knots. Ah, you got so much. We still got headwind. Headwind 215 degrees, 15 knots.
These aircraft were supposedly just 3 minutes apart, and yet one had a headwind, while the other had a tailwind. This was a significant piece of information, which should have alerted both crews to the possibility that something was amiss. What was more likely? That the wind would change so much in the space of just a few miles, or that one of the flights was not where it was supposed to be. The pilots of Flight 15 pointed out that according to the flight plan, the winds should be closer to what they were experiencing.
Is it so? But according to flight plan, wind direction 360, 15 knots approximately. Well, maybe like this.
Well, it may be like this. These words are a perfect demonstration of the psychological phenomenon of confirmation bias, and specifically of the related effect of belief perseverance. This is the tendency to persist in your beliefs even when there is mounting evidence that they are wrong. For the whole journey, the crew of Flight 7 believed that they were on course. That was their reality. When their colleagues, who were apparently just a few miles ahead of them, reported an anomaly, that they were experiencing much different winds than Flight 7 was, the crew's natural response, therefore, was to wave it off as just one of those things that happens. Well, it may be like this. Of course, the horrifying reality was that at that very moment, 2 Soviet fighter jets had taken up position behind them. For the first time that night, the Soviets had eyes on the mystery intruder. The pilot of the closer of the 2 jets, known as an interceptor for obvious reasons, reported that it was too dark to make out what kind of aircraft he was tailing. One of the commanders on the ground said that if it had 4 contrails, then it had to be an RC-135. The commanders were eager not to let the aircraft get away, but at the same time, they knew they couldn't shoot the plane down unless it was over the island, and unless they had positively identified it. But time was running out. The Soviets began a hurried process to identify the aircraft. But crucially, this entire process was informed by something their colleagues had told them earlier, that this was probably a US spy plane. As a result, rather than first treating the plane as a civilian aircraft and trying to call it on the international distress frequency, they immediately began using military interception techniques. This involved using what's known as the friend-foe system, which electronically identifies whether a military aircraft is their own or their enemy's. But, naturally, this yielded no response from the mystery aircraft. The interceptor then employed a more threatening technique. He first flashed his lights, which for one thing was useless given that he was well behind the aircraft, and then he fired warning shots in front of the plane. But again, something crucial was missing. These warning shots from the plane's cannon were not tracer bullets, which can be clearly seen at night. They were just normal, armor-piercing bullets, completely invisible in the nighttime sky. In what can only be described as tragic irony, the Soviets too were now beginning to fall prey to confirmation bias. Everything they tried only confirmed their preconceived belief that this intruder was indeed a US spy plane. However, just like the crew of Flight 7, they would be handed one piece of contradictory evidence, which would give them an opportunity to reassess their conclusions. The ground commanders ordered the pilot of the interceptor to report whether the intruder's navigation lights were on. Navigation lights, or nav lights, are the green and red lights on the wingtips of every plane. No spy plane would leave these lights on if they wanted to remain hidden. If the intruder's nav lights were on, it was quite possible that this mystery aircraft was in fact a wayward passenger jet. Have a look at this transcript from Soviet ground control. It shows the sheer confusion and panic among the commanders as the intruding aircraft began flying over the island. There was chaos as the officers made hurried and half-hearted attempts to identify the aircraft before it re-entered international waters. And amidst all of this confusion, the order was given. The interceptor pilot was to shoot down the intruder. In the cabin of Flight 7, the passengers tried to catch a final bit of sleep before breakfast. The soothing hum of the engines had been a constant companion for the entire journey, but now all of this would change. Up in the cockpit, the pilots had been cleared by air traffic control to climb to flight level 370, 2,000 feet above their current altitude. They dialed this into the autopilot and began climbing. And as the plane went uphill, it slowed down. The interceptor, which was trailing the plane, zoomed past it, unable to slow down in time. The fighter pilot immediately interpreted this as an evasive maneuver for the plane, aimed at putting him in the path of its weapons. On the ground, the commanders were at their wits' end. They had to act now, before the plane. In mere seconds, it would coast out into international waters. The oblivious calm on board Flight 7 was now about to come to an end. The pilot of the interceptor jet pressed the button. 2 seconds later, he pressed it again. In the cabin, all hell broke loose. Missile fragments had punctured the aircraft's skin in dozens of places, and the pressurized air inside began rushing out. The pilots were dumbstruck. Immediately, they tried to take stock of what had happened. The flight engineer confirmed that all 4 engines were working normally. Whatever had exploded, it wasn't an engine. Maybe this was an explosive decompression. Neither the flight crew nor anybody else on board knew that they had been hit by a missile. They still thought they were on course towards Seoul, en route Romeo 20. Within seconds of the missile strike, the plane entered a rapid climb. The autopilot was still engaged, but it was unable to pitch the plane nose down. This was because the hydraulic system that was far from the only. Just 11 seconds after the fuselage had been breached by the missile fragments, enough air had escaped from the cabin that the passenger oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. In the cockpit, the pilots quickly put on air and disengaged. The captain tried to force the nose of the plane down. All the aircraft's 4 hydraulic systems had lost pressure, having been severed by the missile. The pilots were now trapped in an out-of-control aircraft which was screaming upwards at a frightening pace. If it kept climbing like this, it would soon lose enough speed that it would stall and begin falling back to Earth. As all of this was happening, the Soviet commanders frantically tried to ascertain the status of the intruder aircraft. The fighter pilot who fired the missiles reported that the target had been destroyed. Its exterior lights had gone out now, and it was flying erratically. However, the ground commanders could still see the plane on the radar. They urged the second fighter jet to close in and finish the job with its cannons. In the cockpit of Flight 7, the pilots were still oblivious to the fact that their plane was not dying of natural causes.